While most fathers build bonds over years, Carter William barely knew his son. But everything changes the moment 9-year-old Lucas walks into his office and says 6 chilling words. "There's a hidden camera, not yours." In that instant, Carter's high-tech empire shatters. What begins as a cold reunion turns into a dangerous uncovering of betrayal, secrets, and an unlikely alliance between a silent boy and a broken man. Can trust be rebuilt when everything was built on lies? Stay with us. This isn't just a story about espionage. It's about redemption, connection, and the courage to listen before it's too late. The silence in Carter Williams' home office wasn't unusual. Silence had become the default ever since Lucas moved in 3 weeks ago. Ever since the funeral, the legal transition, the awkward welcome. But what broke it today wasn't a slammed door or a muffled cry. It was a single, sharp sentence spoken with eerie clarity. Carter had just tapped his keyboard to skim through performance analytics on a prototype when Lucas appeared at the door, shoulders squared in a stance too grown for his age. "There's a camera hidden in here," the boy said. "And it's not yours." Carter froze, mid-click. For a second, he wasn't sure he'd heard right. Lucas didn't just speak rarely. He barely looked at him, as if acknowledging him too much might make everything worse. But now, here he was, eyes steady, voice calm and disturbingly certain. Carter rose slowly, not out of fear, but out of something far more unsettling. The instinctive trust in what Lucas had just said. He looked at the boy, really looked, and realized for the first time that Lucas wasn't just quiet. He was watching everything. And somehow, in all his stillness, he had seen something Carter hadn't. Carter glanced at the walls, the furniture. The minimalist decor he had once believed communicated sophistication, but now seemed like a series of blind spots. "Where?" he asked, voice level. Lucas didn't answer right away. He walked further in, hesitant only for a second before raising his hand and pointing to a framed abstract print, something decorative Vanessa had insisted on. "There," he said. "Behind that." Carter hesitated, then took it down carefully. He saw nothing at first. But then, with practiced fingers, he traced the edges of the frame and found it, tucked into a corner behind the backing. A microcamera, expertly embedded and wirelessly powered. It wasn't standard equipment. It certainly wasn't his. His stomach tightened. Lucas had been right. The boy had walked into his office, broken their fragile truce of silence, and told him something no one else in the house, including Carter himself, had noticed. Not his head of security, not the software alerts, not the perimeter system. Just Lucas. "How long did you know?" Carter asked, keeping his tone neutral. "A week," Lucas replied. "I checked the signal. It's not encrypted like yours. And it's ... different." Carter turned the camera over in his hand. Different. And dangerous. There was something profoundly disorienting about being outwitted in his own field, and by a child, Carter had built his empire on anticipating threats, neutralizing intrusions before they breached the surface. The fact that someone had slipped past his defenses was bad enough. But the fact that Lucas, a 9-year-old boy with no formal training, had been the one to detect it first, that stung deeper than Carter wanted to admit. Yet as he stood there watching Lucas shift awkwardly under the weight of his own usefulness, Carter felt something else begin to surface, something resembling shame. This boy whom he hadn't raised, hadn't spoken to in years, whom he had once described in court documents as emotionally distant, had walked into his life carrying not just grief, but insight. And Carter, in his distraction and detachment, had almost missed it entirely. "You scanned the signal yourself?" Carter asked, quieter now. Lucas nodded. "I didn't want to tell anyone until I was sure. I thought maybe you'd be mad." "Mad?" Carter blinked. "Why?" Lucas looked at him for the first time, really looked. "Because it's your house, your job. And I saw it before you did." The confession lingered in the air, raw and clean. Carter wasn't angry, he was humbled. In the business world, people paid him millions to find holes in their systems. And here, in the privacy of his own home, the most significant vulnerability hadn't been in the code, it had been in his assumptions. He'd assumed Lucas was fragile. That silence equaled weakness. That the boy needed space, not responsibility. But Lucas wasn't weak. He was cautious, strategic. And for the first time, Carter saw potential instead of pressure. "You did the right thing telling me," he said. "This changes everything." Lucas didn't smile, but something in his posture softened. Not relief exactly, but recognition. They stood there a moment longer, father and son, neither reaching out nor stepping back. There was still a canyon between them, but something had just been built across it. Not trust, not yet, but the frame of a bridge. Carter turned the camera over again in his palm, now studying it with Lucas watching. "I want to know exactly how you found this," he said. "All of it. From the beginning. Lucas hesitated, then slowly walked around the desk and pulled a folded paper from his pocket. On it, drawn with pencil and ruler lines, was a rough map of the house's floor plan. Each room marked with check marks, signal strengths, and scan frequencies. Lucas had done his own sweep, in secret, with tools Carter hadn't even realized were missing from his old tech drawer. I noticed the Wi-Fi spike in the office, the boy began, pointing to the signal chart. It kept refreshing every 45 seconds even when nothing was running, so I traced it. Used the tablet you said was broken. It's not. Just needed a new bootloader. Carter's eyes flicked between the paper and Lucas's face, torn between disbelief and awe. And no one helped you with this? Lucas shook his head. Didn't want to be wrong. Or make it worse. Carter exhaled. The boy wasn't just smart. He was careful, independent. And maybe underneath it all, he had never stopped wanting to matter to someone. You didn't make it worse, Carter said, folding the paper again. You made it real. You made it something we can fix. That word "we" hit harder than either of them let on. Lucas didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. And so the camera sat on the desk, no longer hidden, no longer silent. Its presence marked the beginning of something Carter hadn't expected. Not just a breach in security, but a crack in the walls between himself and the son he barely knew. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, that someone had infiltrated his house under his nose, or that his 9-year-old son had been the one to tell him. Both facts unraveled something foundational in Carter's worldview, that he was always in control, always 10 steps ahead. Not anymore. Lucas had stepped into the spotlight by choice, not by accident, and Carter could no longer ignore him or underestimate him. As he looked back toward the boy still standing by the desk, Carter felt the first flicker of something unexpected. Not pride, not yet, but maybe the seed of it. And with that, he reached for his phone, called his head of security, and simply said, "We've been compromised." Behind him, the frame still leaned against the wall, the hook bare. The space it left behind seemed larger than it should have been, like something more than just a picture had been taken down. In the days that followed the camera discovery, Carter found himself studying Lucas in a way he hadn't done even when the boy was a baby. Back then, Carter had been a visitor in Lucas's life, someone who showed up for birthdays and occasional weekends, then disappeared behind email chains and work trips. But now the boy lived under his roof, moving through the house like a shadow with eyes wide open. Lucas rarely spoke unless directly addressed, and even then his answers came trimmed of anything unnecessary. Still, Carter started noticing things, like how the boy always kept an eye on where the router blinked. How his fingers never moved randomly when on a tablet or laptop. They executed commands with a clarity that belied his age. Lucas wasn't playing games or watching cartoons. He was running diagnostics, writing queries, scanning packet traffic. Carter watched him navigate the mesh network from a stripped-down admin terminal he must have accessed from one of the unmonitored ports in the garage. He hadn't just found one rogue camera, he'd kept digging. And Carter, for the first time in years, didn't know whether to be proud, alarmed, or ashamed that his own son knew more than his entire tech staff. It was Lucas who found the second and third cameras, one behind the vent in the upstairs hallway, and another discreetly embedded in a desk lamp in the guest bedroom that Vanessa sometimes used when she needed space. Carter hadn't touched that room since the day she moved out after their confrontation. The discovery made his skin crawl. Lucas had presented his findings quietly, without flair or performance, almost as if he didn't want to draw attention to himself. Carter remembered the boy placing a piece of printer paper on his desk, unfolded 3 ways, with crude but accurate sketches of the camera placements and data flow arrows leading to a question mark. He didn't explain with words. He simply waited until Carter looked up from the page and said, "You think it's all going to one place?" Lucas nodded. "But it's not where you think." That sentence chilled him. Carter ran independent traces from the corporate VPN and his personal home server, nothing. But Lucas somehow had found a buried relay using a local beacon switch, one that wasn't even logged in the house's access logs. Carter leaned back in his chair, staring at the boy. He wasn't guessing. He knew. And he wasn't trying to impress his father. He was trying to stop a threat. That distinction hit Carter harder than he expected. They started spending more time in the same room, not talking much, but working in quiet proximity. It was Lucas who took initiative. He'd sit at the far end of Carter's office, back straight, fingers flying over a Bluetooth keyboard paired to a spare monitor he'd found in storage. There was a rhythm to his presence, a precision. Carter didn't ask where he learned it. He suspected it wasn't from school. Probably not even from his mother, though she had always said Lucas had a knack for solving things backwards. Carter had always thought it was a poetic way of saying the boy was stubborn. Now he realized it was something else. Lucas worked by reconstructing logic, by eliminating the noise. Watching him felt like seeing a version of himself, only younger, purer, and far less distracted by ambition. And then came the moment Carter had been bracing for. Lucas stopped typing, looked up and said, "It's not external. The source is inside the house. Someone here sent the data out." The words felt like a punch. Carter's breath caught. That was the one outcome he dreaded. Not that someone had broken in, but that someone had been let in. Trusted, invited. He wanted to deny it, instinctively. That it was a bug, a misread signal, a false flag from a smart device hijacked by malware. Lucas had proof. He had isolated packets, stored timestamps, traced upload spikes that coincided with times Vanessa had been alone in the house, including nights when Carter had been away on business. It was irrefutable. And it came not from corporate security, but from a child who'd spent the last 3 weeks pretending not to exist. Carter stood over the boy's shoulder, reading through the data, not saying a word. Lucas didn't ask for validation. He didn't wait for approval. He simply closed the window, backed up the data to a clean drive, and unplugged it without dramatics. Then finally he said, "I think it's personal. They're not just stealing from the company. They're watching you." Carter closed his eyes. The weight of it landed heavily, not just the betrayal, but the implication that his son had been watching him be watched, and he hadn't said a word, not until he was sure, not until it mattered. That kind of discipline, that kind of focus was rare in adults, let alone a child. Let alone his child. That night, Carter couldn't sleep. He sat at the edge of his bed, laptop open, files scattered across his screen, but his mind stuck somewhere else entirely. He thought about the birthdays he'd missed, the milestones he hadn't been there for, the years of court-ordered visits where Lucas barely spoke to him. Carter had always told himself the boy was naturally closed off, maybe even a little cold. But now he saw it differently. Lucas hadn't been cold. He had been patient, calculating, waiting for something real. And maybe now, with danger inside the walls and loyalty hanging by a thread, that something real had finally happened. Carter realized then that he hadn't just underestimated his son's intelligence, he had underestimated his heart. The boy didn't want revenge. He wanted protection. And perhaps even deeper than that, connection. The thought made Carter's chest tighten in a way that no board meeting, no hostile takeover, no billion-dollar failure had ever done. It wasn't just about fixing the breach anymore. It was about fixing what had been broken long before the first signal was ever traced. In the end, Carter found himself watching Lucas the same way Lucas had once watched him, from a distance. Quietly, respectfully, trying to read between the silences. The boy would sit at the breakfast table with a tablet in hand, headphones around his neck, but Carter noticed how he always glanced up when Carter entered the room. Never in fear, just in quiet calculation. They shared moments, small ones, passing the milk without speaking, exchanging a dry comment about the firewall's lag, or simply sitting in the same space without needing to justify it. It wasn't affection, not yet, but it was a start. Lucas had proven something Carter hadn't even known he needed to see, that even when unseen, unheard, and uninvited, some children still stay, still try, still believe. And maybe, just maybe, that was what made them unshakable, what made them worth listening to. And so in those days that followed, Carter began seeing Lucas not as a child cast aside by time and distance, but as a beacon in the dark, someone who had always been watching, even when no one else had noticed. Carter stared at Vanessa with the kind of stillness that made words irrelevant. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw accusations across the room like knives. The evidence was already there, lined up, time-stamped, and undeniable. The monitor behind him displayed a loop of camera feeds, encrypted chats and server logs cross-referenced with her login credentials. Vanessa stood near the window, her arms crossed over her chest, though her posture betrayed more than defensiveness. She was trembling. "This isn't what it looks like," she whispered, her voice cracking. Carter tilted his head slightly, not in confusion but in disbelief at her choice of words. "Then tell me," he said evenly, "what exactly is it?" Her response came delayed, broken by a shallow breath. "It was never about you, Carter. It was about your company, about your reach. You think you build walls high enough and no one can touch you. But that's not how the world works." Her eyes brimmed with tears, but there was no sincerity in them. Not anymore. Whatever affection had existed between them had evaporated in the face of what now stood exposed. Betrayal. Deliberate and strategic. Carter didn't flinch. He just listened, not to her words but to the silence beneath them. She shifted tactics, as he had expected. "You think I didn't love you?" she asked, stepping closer. "You think this was all fake?" Her voice carried more desperation now, but not remorse. Panic. The panic of a plan collapsing too early. Carter said nothing, just turned the monitor toward her so she could see herself in the logs. The access timestamps matched nights he had been out of town. The file copies were routed through dummy drives, traced back to a shell account linked to a rival firm. The kicker was the message, short, clean, and final, that she had sent just 2 nights ago. The window is closing. I'll have the core by Friday. Her lips parted, but no sound came. How long? Carter finally asked. From the beginning? Vanessa's expression fractured then, like something deep inside her cracked under the weight of the truth. No, she said too quickly. No, it wasn't supposed to be like this. It changed. You changed. Carter laughed once, bitter and cold. No, Vanessa, you didn't. He waited for her to offer something real, an apology perhaps, but all she gave him was a look of a cornered animal, not ashamed, just caught. What wounded Carter more than the data breach or corporate sabotage was how well she had played the part, the quiet affection, the willingness to wait for Lucas to warm up to her, the thoughtful gestures, the shared late-night talks about the future. All of it now felt like a polished performance rehearsed in the shadows of ulterior motives. And the bitter truth underneath it all was this: Lucas had known. Somehow, in his quiet observation, in his measured silences, the boy had seen through Vanessa long before Carter did. And Carter hadn't listened, not once. He had brushed off Lucas's distance as grief, as resentment from the past, never once considering that the boy might have been protecting him. The weight of that mistake felt heavier than Vanessa's betrayal. It was failure on a deeper level, not of intelligence, but of intuition. He knew, Carter said aloud, more to himself than to her. Lucas knew something wasn't right. And I told him to stay out of grown-up matters. Vanessa's lips twitched, almost into a smile. He's smart, she said. Too smart. That kid's going to get hurt if you don't teach him when to stop digging. That was when. Carter's hands curled into fists at his sides. I think you should go, Carter said, his voice stripped of emotion. Now, Vanessa hesitated. She was scanning for an angle, a weakness, a way to spin this into sympathy, but there was nothing left to spin. Carter, she said softly now, as though the right inflection might save her. I didn't want it to end like this. Carter narrowed his eyes. You're lucky it's ending only like this. He gestured toward the door. You can walk out, or you can wait here for the authorities. Your call. The shift in her expression told him everything. She had hoped, even expected, that he might still protect her, that the affection they'd built or pretended to would give her leverage. But Carter had no more space for illusions. Not after what she'd done, not after what Lucas had uncovered. Vanessa moved slowly, like someone accepting a verdict she knew she deserved, but still hoped might be overturned at the last second. She didn't beg. She didn't confess. She just walked away, heels clicking softly against the wood floor until the sound vanished down the hallway. Carter stood in the same place for a long time, staring at the now empty doorway, wondering how he had let a snake curl itself so close to his chest. Later that night, Carter sat alone in the kitchen, the overhead light off, the blue glow of his laptop reflecting in his tired eyes. The files were all backed up now, sealed into a secure server, the proper channels notified. Vanessa's access had been revoked, and the internal audit was already underway. But none of it felt like closure. Because the real breach hadn't been technical, it had been personal, and the consequences extended far beyond his company. Lucas passed through the kitchen briefly, barefoot, carrying a glass of water. He paused when he saw Carter, then silently walked to the table and placed a folded paper beside him. These are the other devices, he said simply, then turned to leave. Carter called out gently, Lucas. The boy stopped, turned halfway. I'm listening now, Carter said, and I'm sorry it took me so long. Lucas gave him a brief nod, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. Then he walked away again, just as quiet, but somehow a little lighter. Carter unfolded the paper. There were coordinates, sketches, signal IDs, a map of every hidden eye in the house. It was a child's drawing. It was a warning. It was a lifeline. Carter stared at the last screen still active on his laptop, Vanessa's encrypted messages, now decrypted and organized. He didn't need to read them again. Every word had already carved itself into his memory. She had played him. She had violated the sanctity of their home. But what tore at him more deeply was the realization that his silence had mirrored hers. That in all the years he had spent building firewalls and encrypting data, he had forgotten the value of simply listening. Lucas had known, and he hadn't listened. He had watched his son shrink into silence, interpreting it as distance when it had been warning. Carter had failed, not as a CEO, but as a father, and now all he could do was own it. The mirror of betrayal didn't just reflect Vanessa's face. It reflected his own. In the end, Carter stood in that quiet house, no longer protected by glass walls and smart locks, no longer deceived by rehearsed smiles. He saw clearly now, saw everything. He had been a man of security, undone by the one he let into his home, and by the silence of the one he never truly heard. Lucas didn't ask why Vanessa had done what she did. He didn't mention the fact that he'd noticed her long before Carter had. He didn't gloat, or say "I told you so," or even allow a smug smile to flicker across his lips. Instead, he simply watched, quietly, consistently. He was always nearby now, sitting at the edge of Carter's office during meetings, lingering behind when analysts gave progress reports, his fingers twitching slightly as he listened, absorbed, calculated. It was like having a human algorithm in the room, one with intuition and emotional radar sharpened by silence. Carter started letting him stay. At first, it was more instinct than choice, the same way a drowning man clutches the closest thing that floats. But soon, Carter began to realize something deeper. Lucas's presence wasn't just comforting, it was stabilizing. In the aftermath of betrayal, when every look and every word from colleagues felt like a potential lie, Lucas was the only one in the room who didn't wear a mask. He didn't ask for explanations, he simply saw. And somehow that made Carter feel less alone, less blind. As if his son had become the one clear signal in a sea of encrypted noise. The first few times they worked together, it was awkward. Carter still spoke like a CEO, commanding, clipped, measured. Lucas, on the other hand, didn't speak much at all. He just moved, typed, nodded. At one point, Carter tried to correct the way Lucas had labeled certain threat signatures on a shared file. Lucas paused, stared at the screen, then quietly changed them back after Carter walked away. Later that night, Carter reopened the file and saw that Lucas had been right. It stung. Not because his pride was bruised, but because he realized he had done the one thing he had promised himself never to do again: underestimate the boy. From then on, he let Lucas lead certain tasks. Nothing dangerous, nothing that would put him in legal crossfire. But he gave him access, real access, and Lucas responded in kind. He started making suggestions, subtle ones, never overstepping. When Carter sent an email to their cyber forensics contractor outlining the next steps, Lucas quietly pointed out the signature block contained tracking pixels. "Who else reads your email?" he asked softly. Carter had never thought to ask himself that question, not until his 9-year-old forced him to. What grew between them wasn't exactly trust, not yet. It was something more foundational: presence. Lucas showed up, every day. He didn't demand Carter's time, but he was there, consistently in the background and sometimes beside him, working. And Carter stopped treating that presence as temporary. They began syncing in rhythm, not through forced bonding moments or scheduled father-son talks, but through shared problem solving, through the language of patterns, gaps in data, and breach vectors. It was in that common language that they first truly connected, not as parent and child, but as two minds aligned by necessity and forged by betrayal. Carter still carried guilt, especially when he caught glimpses of how Lucas's shoulders tensed around strangers, or how his eyes flicked instinctively to exits in a room. These were not the reflexes of a carefree child. They were survival mechanisms. Carter realized that his absence had taught Lucas how to endure, how to rely on himself. Now, in an ironic twist of fate, Carter had to earn his son's reliance. And oddly, he didn't resent that. He welcomed it. Because every day Lucas chose to work beside him was a day Carter hadn't lost. And that in this fragile new reality mattered more than anything else. One night, as they were reviewing server data in Carter's study, Lucas suddenly said, "Your partner's signature is on 2 of these breach timestamps." Carter froze. Miles, his oldest friend, the man who had co-founded Heon with him in a dorm room. "You sure?" Carter asked. Lucas didn't answer right away. He just opened a different set of logs, ran a quick cross-analysis, and turned the screen toward his father. There it was. Access logs from an internal channel, confirmed by biometric entry, signed in under Miles's clearance. "I didn't want to say anything until I was sure," Lucas said. Carter felt the wind knocked out of him, not just by the betrayal, but by the maturity of the boy in front of him. Lucas hadn't come to him with suspicions. He had come with proof, with restraint, with discernment. It shook Carter in a different way. "You trusted me with this?" Carter asked. Lucas gave a tiny shrug. "You're listening now," he said, his voice quiet but steady. Carter nodded. "I am." And for the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't painful. It was powerful. Like the space between notes and music that makes the melody matter. Carter began noticing that Lucas had a pattern, not just in his coding, but in his emotional signals. He'd never asked for affection, but he'd stayed longer in rooms where he felt safe. He didn't like eye contact, but he always listened. He'd offer Carter his findings like one might offer a gift, carefully, without presumption, waiting to see if it would be received. And Carter learned to receive them. Sometimes they worked in silence for hours, and sometimes Lucas would drop a single sentence that carried more weight than 100 conversations. One evening, Lucas said, "When people lie, their patterns change. You just have to know where to look." Carter stopped typing. "Who taught you that?" Lucas didn't look up. No one. But Carter wasn't so sure. Life had taught him. Neglect had taught him. And now Carter was trying to unteach those lessons by showing up every day without fail. Not with grand declarations or empty promises, just with presence. With eyes that saw, with ears that finally heard, with hands that no longer pushed away. It was working, slowly, but it was working. And then one night, long after he thought Lucas had gone to bed, Carter passed by his son's room and noticed the door slightly ajar. He didn't mean to intrude, but something made him pause. Inside, Lucas was asleep on the bed, a notebook open beside him. Carter stepped in quietly and picked it up. On the page was a drawing, rough, done in pencil, but unmistakable. It was the two of them, not holding hands, not smiling, just standing side by side. Carter in his usual suit, Lucas in his hoodie, both of them facing forward, serious. Above them, in Lucas's careful handwriting, were 3 words. Not father, ally. Carter sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the drawing for a long time. It wasn't sentimental, wasn't poetic, it was accurate. That's how Lucas saw them now, not bound by obligation, but joined by purpose. Carter closed the notebook gently and placed it back where it was. Then he stood up, turned off the light, and left the room with something in his chest that hadn't been there before. A kind of fragile, stubborn hope. They weren't healed, not yet, but they were fighting the same war, together. When Carter finally stood across from Miles, there was no dramatic scene, no shouting match. No swinging fists or broken trust spelled out in loud accusations. Just 2 men in a room, weighed down by everything unspoken between them. Carter didn't waste time. He laid the evidence out flat on the table, server logs, financial transactions, backdoor entries traced to Miles's credentials, and the fatal timestamp that tied it all together. "I need you to tell me I'm wrong," Carter said quietly. "Tell me this isn't what it looks like." Miles sat motionless, his fingers loosely laced in front of him. His eyes didn't rise to meet Carter's. For the first time in their 2-decade friendship, Miles had no words, and that said everything. Silence hung between them like a confession, thicker than any lie. Carter felt a rage creeping up his spine, but it wasn't just anger, it was heartbreak. "Why?" he demanded. "You had everything. We built this together." Miles exhaled shakily, still looking down. "Exactly, we built it. And somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like ours. You made every call. Took every spotlight." The bitterness in his voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut. Carter blinked, staggered not by the betrayal itself anymore, but by how small the reason was. "You think this was about credit?" he asked, voice tightening. "So you sold us out?" Miles finally looked up, eyes tired and red. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said. "At first it was just, leverage, insurance, in case things went bad. But then Vanessa came in and Monarch made their offer and he stopped himself." "Monarch," Carter repeated, the name now a bitter thread in all of this. "So this goes beyond the core, beyond us." Miles didn't nod, but he didn't deny it either. "They promised control, Carter. Over governments, over economies. With the core, they could predict market collapses before they happen, stop wars before they start." Carter laughed once, cold and short. "You mean start wars before they stop?" he corrected. "And you thought that was a worthy trade?" Miles looked genuinely pained. "I thought I'd keep them at bay from the inside, but they're too big." The words rang like excuses. Maybe they were. Maybe Miles believed them. But Carter didn't. Not anymore. The man sitting in front of him wasn't his partner. He was the lock that let the enemy walk in through the front door. The conversation shifted then, not in tone, but in gravity. Carter's disappointment became heavier than his anger. "You could have told me," he said, quieter now. "Before everything imploded, before she planted cameras in my house. Before my son had to be the one to uncover it all." Miles flinched at that. "Lucas? I didn't want him involved." "Too late," Carter replied. "He's more involved than either of us should have let him be. And he saw it. He saw you, Miles, and he said nothing. You know why?" Miles didn't answer, so Carter continued. "Because he thought I wouldn't believe him." There was a sharpness in Carter's voice then that cracked something between them. For all the technical betrayal, the stolen data, the sabotage, the money, It was this fracture of trust that hit hardest. Miles had been family, closer than family. And now Carter couldn't even look at him without wondering how many moments, how many conversations had been colored by lies. "I came to you with every risk," Carter said, "and you were the one person I never thought to protect myself from." Miles opened his mouth, but there was no defense. Only guilt, the kind that came too late to change anything. By the time the conversation shifted toward consequences, there was little left to salvage. Carter wasn't interested in revenge, not really. He was interested in integrity, in the remains of what Huon had stood for before it became a battlefield of betrayals. "You'll confess," Carter said. "Voluntarily. You'll hand over every file, every contact, and every off-record communication with Monarch. Or I'll release everything I have to the feds. Today." Miles didn't argue. He nodded slowly, as if the weight of it all had finally settled on his shoulders. "It was never supposed to get this far," he said again, like a broken record. Carter shook his head. "That's what everyone says when they realize the fire's not just burning someone else's house." He stood up, walked toward the door, then stopped. "You want a sliver of redemption? Start with the truth, not the version that keeps you safe. The real one." Miles didn't move. He just sat there, a man undone by choices he'd tried to rationalize until they collapsed under their own weight. Carter left without looking back. Some relationships didn't deserve closure, only consequences. And this one was past the point of repair. Carter didn't return to his office after that. Instead, he walked to the west wing of the building where Lucas was reviewing security anomalies flagged during their last scan. The boy looked up when Carter entered, eyes immediately scanning his father's face. "He didn't deny it," Carter said. Lucas nodded, unsurprised. "I didn't think he would." There was no triumph in his voice, just calm acknowledgement. "You okay?" Lucas asked. Carter wasn't sure how to answer. "No," he admitted. "But I will be, eventually." Lucas returned to the screen, typed a few commands, then said, "We need to change the internal root keys." He had access to everything. Carter nodded slowly. "Start drafting a new architecture. I want every line of legacy code out of the core by Monday." Lucas didn't hesitate. The boy who had once lived in his father's shadow was now standing beside him in the wreckage, ready to rebuild. Not with hope, not yet, but with purpose. And that was enough. For now. They worked in silence again, but it was a silence that no longer divided them. It connected. It was the sound of rebuilding, one line of trust at a time. The weight of it all didn't crash down on Carter until much later, when he returned home and collapsed onto the edge of the living room couch. His phone buzzed with follow-up calls from legal and compliance teams, but he ignored them. The world could wait. He felt raw, exposed, like someone who had survived a storm only to realize the storm was still inside him. That's when Lucas came into the room holding 2 glasses of water. He handed one to Carter, then sat beside him without saying a word. Minutes passed. Then, without prompting, Lucas reached out and gripped his father's wrist, firm, steady, grounding. "We can still turn this around," he said. "No dramatic flair, no bravado, just certainty." Carter looked at him, really looked, and saw not the boy he had failed to understand for years, but the partner he never knew he needed. And in that moment, surrounded by betrayal and uncertainty, Carter didn't feel lost, because he wasn't alone anymore. Lucas was the one who came up with the plan. His voice was quiet, but his words were clear, as if he had been thinking about it for days before daring to speak. "We can let them steal something," he said, "but only what you want them to steal." Carter raised an eyebrow. "A decoy?" Coy Lucas nodded. "A corrupted one, laced with trackers. Something irresistible enough to make them bite." There was no pride in his tone, only strategy. No childlike excitement, only calm execution. Carter stared at his son and wondered when exactly he had stopped seeing him as a kid. The idea was sound, more than sound. It was brilliant. Together they sketched out a false project. A convincing front loaded with layers of dummy code and data packages laced with ultra-stealth micro-trackers. Carter had once led global teams in cybersecurity, and yet here he was, taking tactical notes from a 9-year-old who had spent the last few years learning in silence. And the strangest part? He didn't feel threatened by that. He felt relieved. For the first time in weeks, there was clarity. Direction. They were not just reacting anymore. They were setting the pace. What followed were long hours in front of multiple screens, assembling, encrypting, layering. Carter took the lead initially out of habit more than necessity, but quickly realized Lucas's intuition about how intruders think was sharper than his. The boy could anticipate where someone might look first, how they'd prioritize certain files, and what kind of naming structure would catch the eye of a seasoned thief. No one steals something called version test before, Lucas said, deleting a file name Carter had created. They steal things labeled prototype final. Carter laughed under his breath. It was absurd, but accurate, so they leaned into it. They built a digital treasure map filled with fake gold, the kind of data that would make any corporate spy believe they'd struck something real. But embedded in every file were Carter's specially designed nano-beacons trackers, invisible to most security software but capable of mapping data access routes in real time. "You trust me with this?" Carter asked once as Lucas encoded one of the root files. Lucas didn't look up. "You trusted me first." It wasn't a sentimental answer. It was factual, and it was true. Their rhythm evolved. They no longer spoke in full sentences, but in shorthand and instinct. A glance, a nod, a pause. It was enough. It wasn't just productive. It was bonding. Not the kind that comes from forced closeness, but the kind that emerges when two people solve a problem that actually matters. Lucas wasn't smiling often, but occasionally. Carter would catch the flicker of it, that involuntary glint in the corner of his son's mouth when a solution worked. When a system synced, when a line of code flowed clean. It reminded Carter of himself at that age, except he had been chasing success. Lucas was chasing safety. It was a sobering realization. His son had learned to protect himself not through confrontation, but through foresight. Carter was only now beginning to understand the cost of that skill. He didn't try to fix it with apologies. Instead, he worked with him, beside him, not above him. Each hour they spent layering the trap was another step away from the version of their lives that had been shattered. Lucas didn't ask for validation, but Carter gave it anyway, in trust, in space, and in silence. Then came the waiting. Once the files were uploaded to a fake internal project folder labeled High-End Corey Extended Archive, Carter pinged one of the compromised servers. Nothing blatant, just enough to make it visible. "Now we watch," he said. Lucas nodded, already scanning for outgoing pings. They waited 2 hours. Nothing. Then, late into the night, a data request came in. It was small at first, a test. The tracker lit up instantly. "They're sniffing," Lucas whispered. Another hour passed. Then the full breach happened. A total extraction of the dummy package. The beacons launched without detection, quietly following the data's route through proxy after proxy, leaping from mask to mask until, ping, a return signal landed. Carter leaned forward. "Do you see that node?" Lucas zoomed in. "It's not in any known registry. Off-grid?" "Mostly," Lucas confirmed, "but not invisible. It bounces off a real IP long enough to leave a shadow." They traced it. The signal ended on a remote node buried inside a server farm Carter didn't recognize. It wasn't corporate, it wasn't civilian, it was something else. "Whoever this is," Carter said, "they're good." Lucas didn't answer. He was already setting up the next layer trace. Despite the tension, Carter felt something shift inside him, something deep. It wasn't just about winning. It was about rebuilding the ground beneath their feet. Lucas was no longer a ghost in his home. He was an anchor, a constant. And Carter, for the first time, was learning from him. Not just about code and tactics, but about patience, awareness, and what it meant to show up for someone even after you'd failed them. "You think they'll come back for more?" Carter asked. Lucas didn't hesitate. "They always do." That certainty wasn't arrogance, it was pattern recognition. It was a child who had lived long enough on the fringes of trust to know how betrayal behaves. "Then we'll be ready," Carter replied. "And this time we're leading the game." For hours afterward, they fine-tuned the data trail, made backup logs, rerouted dead ends. It was no longer about defending what was left, it was about controlling what came next. For every move Monarch made, Carter and Lucas would make 3. Not because they had to, because they could. Because they were no longer playing catch-up. They were building a battlefield of their own. And when the final tracker lit up with a location ping, a traceable signal pointing to a node outside their known network range, Lucas leaned back, his eyes steady. "Now we know where to look," he said. No celebration, no victory grin, just resolution. Carter looked at him, really looked, and saw not just a boy with talent, but a mind built from shadows and silence, now stepping into light. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about the company anymore. It was about truth, about reclaiming control. Carter gave a single nod. They were no longer defending the past. They were hunting the future. Vanessa had been captured quickly and cleanly, a tactical extraction rather than a public spectacle. When Carter entered the holding room, she was already seated, wrists cuffed, her once perfect composure stripped down to a quiet, dangerous calm. There were no guards shouting orders, no chaos. just her eyes fixed on him as if she'd been waiting for this meeting her entire life. Carter didn't speak first. He slid the evidence packet across the table, the final compilation of logs, images, and transaction trails that had sealed her fate. Vanessa glanced at it, but didn't touch it. "You think this is about the company?" she said softly, her voice steady. "You still don't see what's right in front of you." Carter ignored the bait. "I see betrayal," he replied. "I see someone I trusted gutting my home from the inside." Vanessa's mouth twitched, not a smile, but a trace of something like pity. "You still think you're the only one hurt," she said. "You've been blind for a long time, Carter." He leaned forward, cold. "You're done manipulating me." But she shook her head. "I'm not trying to manipulate you anymore. I'm telling you the truth. You keep avoiding." Her voice sharpened then, not with anger, but with something closer to finality. "You never looked at him," she said. "Never listened to him. But he's yours, Carter. He's better than you. Better than all of this." The words landed like a blow. Carter didn't flinch outwardly, but inside something shifted, like a lock turning. He thought of Lucas sitting silently in meeting rooms, decoding the traps they'd walked into, drawing diagrams late at night. He thought of how many times he'd dismissed the boy's silences as withdrawal rather than warning. Vanessa saw the flicker in his eyes and pressed the point. "I'm not saying this to save myself," she continued. "I'm saying it because you'll lose him the way you've lost everything else if you don't wake up." Carter tried to maintain his composure. "You don't get to talk about him," he said flatly. "You used him." Vanessa's expression hardened. "No, I used you. He was the only one in that house who actually saw what I was doing. He's the only reason you're still standing." Carter stayed silent, but his grip on the table tightened. This wasn't the confession he'd expected. It wasn't even an apology. It was a mirror. Vanessa had stopped playing for leniency and started handing him something far more uncomfortable. Perspective. "Why tell me this now?" he asked finally. Vanessa lowered her gaze for the first time. "Because it's over," she said. "And because you need to know what you're walking into." Her next words came measured, deliberate. "Monarch. That's who you're chasing. Not a company, not a person, a system. A network that doesn't just take your data. It rewrites the ground you stand on. If you go after them thinking it's just business, you'll be swallowed whole. And Lucas," she paused, "Lucas will pay for your blind spots." Carter's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the way her voice carried no theatrics. It was just truth, unvarnished. "Monarch," he repeated, tasting the word like a threat. Vanessa nodded. "They're already watching you." Even now, cuffed and cornered, Vanessa still had the upper hand in one way. She knew things. Carter didn't. But there was also something else flickering beneath her composure. Hesitation. Not fear exactly. More like regret, the kind that leaks out when the game you've played finally ends and you're forced to look at what you've become. She met Carter's gaze again. "You think I want them to win?" she asked. "I don't, but they will if you keep pretending you're untouchable. If you don't learn to listen." Carter almost asked what she meant, but stopped himself. She'd already said enough. He understood, at least partially, what she was pointing to. Lucas. The boy had been his blind spot and his saving grace all at once. Vanessa had seen it. He hadn't. And even now, he wasn't sure he was ready to face what that said about him as a father. They sat in silence for a long moment, not the hostile silence of enemies, but the exhausted silence of two people who had run out of moves. Vanessa broke it first. "This is as much as I can give you," she said. "The rest, you'll have to figure out on your own." Carter nodded slowly, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. He gestured to the guards at the door. Vanessa stood up without resisting. As they moved to lead her out, she hesitated, turning back toward him one last time. Her eyes no longer begged. They no longer lied. They simply held the truth he couldn't yet swallow. "He's yours, Carter," she said quietly. "Don't waste what's left." Then she let herself be led away, her steps steady but slower now, as if she were walking toward something inevitable rather than fleeing from it. Carter remained where he was, frozen in place. Vanessa's words replayed in his head like a looping echo he couldn't mute. Monarch, Lucas, blind spots. He realized with a cold clarity that she hadn't been trying to escape punishment at all. She had been trying in her own way to give him a chance, to save him from a threat he couldn't yet see clearly. Even in betrayal, she'd given him the one thing no one else had, a warning. Carter stared at the empty doorway long after she was gone, not sure whether he felt gratitude or fury. All he knew was that her last words had opened a wound he could no longer ignore, a wound he would have to face if he wanted to protect what mattered most. The deeper Carter and Lucas dug, the less human their enemy appeared. What began as a digital trail of encrypted packets and access logs evolved into a full-blown descent into a faceless labyrinth of deception. Monarch wasn't a hacker or a mole or a corrupt CEO. It wasn't even a name that belonged to a person. It was a system, fluid, ever-shifting, without a center. Every piece of evidence pointed toward a decentralized collective, operating beneath the legal and visible infrastructures of the world. The servers were hidden in offshore data havens. The usernames were generated by is designed to mimic human speech. The financial transactions ran through layered shell companies in at least 5 countries. Carter stared at his screen in disbelief one night as Lucas explained a sequence of firewall breaches in Switzerland that matched a pattern from Singapore. "They don't sleep," Lucas murmured. "They don't care about money either. It's like they're building something." That phrase sat heavy in Carter's chest. Monarch wasn't stealing from him, they were practicing on him. Testing vulnerabilities, rehearsing the scripts they'd use on much larger targets. He looked at his son, hunched over 2 laptops, and felt the full weight of what they were up against. Lucas had grown quieter, but not from fear. There was a steadiness in him now, like he had accepted that danger was no longer a concept, but a condition of their lives. Carter couldn't remember the last time he'd asked Lucas about school, about friends, about anything beyond their shared mission. And yet, the boy didn't seem resentful. If anything, he seemed focused. Sometimes Carter caught him writing things in a small notebook. Not code, but thoughts, questions, observations. Why do people destroy what they love? Was one of them. Do enemies know when they're creating heroes? Was another, but Carter didn't ask. He still felt unqualified to be Lucas's father, even now, especially now. His instinct was to protect, to keep the boy away from this darkness. But Lucas had already walked in on his own. And more than once it was Lucas who spotted patterns Carter missed. When a series of digital fingerprints traced back to an abandoned crypto node in Estonia, it was Lucas who identified the network handoff that proved Monarch was using Heon's algorithms against them. "They're teaching your AI to lie," Lucas said. Carter went cold. This wasn't just theft anymore, it was inversion. They moved their operations off-grid. Carter shut down the internal server farms and relocated their decoding efforts to a secure temporary unit he once used for military contracts. Only a skeleton crew knew where they were. Lucas now had his own workstation, not as a guest, but as a partner. Carter began treating him like an equal, which felt both right and heartbreaking. No child should carry this burden, but Lucas was already carrying it silently. Carter began journaling again, something he hadn't done in years. He wrote about the way Lucas stayed awake until 3 a.m., without being told, how he asked questions that cut straight through adult lies, how he didn't seek praise, just clarity. One night, Carter watched from the doorway as Lucas carefully assembled a flowchart of all the known Monarch nodes. It wasn't the precision that struck him. It was the tenderness. Every connection was drawn in pencil, not ink, as if Lucas understood nothing was absolute. Everything could change. When Carter asked him why he did that, Lucas simply said, "I like the idea that we can still fix some things." Carter didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, fighting the burn behind his eyes. Then came the breakthrough. A disguised server in Venezuela pinged back through a trapdoor Lucas had built weeks earlier. Inside the data dump was a cache of blacklisted IPs, private keys, and command logs enough to cripple one arm of Monarch's infrastructure. But it wasn't the digital payload that shook Carter. It was a file buried deep in a directory labeled constructs. Inside it were psychological profiles, hundreds of them. People of influence, scientists, judges, even whistleblowers. Monarch didn't just steal data. They watched people, broke them down into algorithms of behavior. And Carter's name was in there, so was Lucas's. There was a full dossier on their patterns, vulnerabilities, emotional triggers. "We're not just targets," Carter whispered. "We're templates." Lucas said nothing, but his hands clenched into fists. They were being used to build something that could manipulate millions. This wasn't cybercrime anymore. It was engineering, mass-scale behavioral engineering. That realization shifted something in Carter. No longer was he defending a company. He was defending reality, at least the version of it still untouched. And yet, amidst all the unthinkable, Carter had begun to notice something else. Lucas had started leaving little things on his desk. A diagram folded neatly. A USB labeled backup, just in case. A single sticky note with a time. 12:30. Take a break. They weren't instructions. They were invitations. Lucas was reaching out in the way he knew how, through action. Carter found himself responding. He made sandwiches without asking, bought Lucas a new laptop without ceremony, began checking in, not as a security measure, but as a father. One night after a long shift, Carter opened Lucas's backpack looking for a charger. Instead, he found a worn notebook tucked into the side pocket. He almost put it back, but curiosity won. On the last page was a sentence scribbled in small, hesitant handwriting. "If you want me to stay, I can." Carter froze. The words hit harder than any betrayal, any leak, any threat, because they weren't about strategy. They were about home. About the boy who had once been an afterthought, now asking for permission to belong. Carter sat with the notebook for a long time. The noise of their investigation fell away. All that remained was that sentence. "If you want me to stay, I can, not I will, not I'm staying." It was a question disguised as an offer, a final door left ajar. Carter had spent so much time trying to fix the company, the breach, the systems, that he hadn't realized the most critical fix was standing right in front of him, holding his gaze, waiting. And in that quiet, Carter understood that their mission had shifted long ago. The war with Monarch was real, but so was the healing between them. Lucas didn't need Carter to be a perfect father. He needed him to choose him, not out of guilt, but out of want. Carter carefully placed the notebook back in the bag. He didn't write anything. He didn't need to. He would show Lucas in the days to come in the way he stayed close, the way he listened, the way he trusted. What had started as a war to save a company had become something far more sacred, the fight to rebuild a family. And reading that note had been all Carter needed to hear. Carter stood in front of the whiteboard in his private lab, marker in hand, staring at the outdated architecture of the home's internal security network. For years it had been his pride. Layers of encryption, AI-driven surveillance, automated threat detection. It had served its purpose until it didn't. The failure hadn't been in the code, but in the assumption that security came from control, not understanding. This time he didn't want a one-man fortress. He wanted something resilient, something smarter. And he knew instinctively that he couldn't do it alone. Turning to Lucas, who sat across the room idly sketching in a notepad, Carter spoke without preamble. "What if we built something new? Together?" Lucas didn't respond at first. His pencil paused midline. Then he looked up, not skeptically, not with doubt, but with something far heavier. The need to believe it wasn't just a symbolic offer like ... from scratch, he asked. Carter nodded. From scratch. The boy set the notepad down and walked over. For the first time since they had been forced into the same house, he wasn't a guest. He wasn't even just a son. He was a builder, a partner, a witness to his father's rebuilding, not of machines, but of himself. The following days bled together in a focused rhythm of code and conversation. Lucas took the lead in drafting schematic flows, proposing variables Carter hadn't considered. Carter began to step back, not because he didn't understand, but because he started to see that Lucas saw things differently, intuitively. They worked side by side, and during those hours, the silence between them wasn't strained. It was full. Each pause was a choice, not a void. One afternoon, while reviewing the data shielding layers, Carter made a joke about Lucas being the only 9-year-old who knew how to isolate packet leaks. Lucas smirked, but didn't respond with a joke. Instead, he asked, "Did you ever think I'd be like this?" The question caught Carter mid-keystroke. He looked at his son, really looked, and admitted quietly, "I didn't think much at all. That's the problem." Lucas didn't respond immediately, but he nodded slowly and they went back to work. That nod meant more to Carter than any forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. They were building more than a system. They were laying down code between them, syntax of trust, logic of healing. One evening, Lucas showed Carter a subroutine he had designed to redirect intrusion attempts through a false feedback loop. It was elegant, efficient, impressive. Carter didn't say it out loud, but he didn't need to. Lucas saw it in his eyes. The boy's hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he asked, "What happens when it's done? The system?" Carter asked. Lucas shrugged. "Everything." It was a question loaded with the kind of weight no child should have to carry, the knowledge that all of this closeness, this purpose, might just be a byproduct of crisis. Carter didn't have an answer, but he did something different this time. He didn't dodge. He didn't make promises he wasn't ready to keep. He simply said, "Then we build something else." And Lucas, for the first time, smiled not out of irony or politeness, but with real warmth. A boy being seen. A father choosing to see. Later that night, while searching for a misplaced drive, Carter opened the bottom drawer of Lucas's desk. He hadn't meant to pry, but what he found stopped him. Tucked beneath an old tablet and a folded hoodie were several envelopes, carefully stacked, with his ex-wife's handwriting on the front. Letters, messages, maybe even memories Lucas hadn't shared. Alongside them was a photo, a worn-out snapshot of Lucas as a toddler sitting on his mother's lap, both of them laughing. Carter sat down, the picture in his hand, and realized he was holding proof of a world he had stepped away from too easily. And next to that photo was something else, a spiral-bound notebook filled with graphs, flowcharts, and sketches. The title on the first page was handwritten in blue markers, System Proposal for Kids Like Me. Carter flipped through page after page, outlining an idea, a security framework for orphaned or displaced children, built to protect, alert, and connect. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a blueprint. Purpose. And it had been in Carter's house the whole time. Unnoticed. Carter approached Lucas gently the next morning. He held the notebook with care, as if it might break if handled wrong. "You made this?" he asked. Lucas nodded without looking up. It was just an idea, for later. Carter crouched to eye level. "Let's make it for now." That's when he offered it, the name. "We should call it Proteus," Carter said. Lucas blinked, confused. "Like the Greek thing?" Carter nodded. Proteus changes shape, adapts, but above all, it protects. Lucas stared at him for a long second, eyes calculating, skeptical, then slowly a grin broke through. "Proteus," he repeated. "I like it. It sounds alive." That one word, alive, lingered between them, because it wasn't just about software. It was about identity, possibility, maybe even redemption. They got to work that same day, transferring some of the firewall principles from their home system into a more universal structure. Carter began reaching out to contacts in the nonprofit sector, quietly, privately. This wasn't Heon, this wasn't about market dominance. This was for Lucas, and for the kids Lucas had thought about when no one had been thinking about him. As they coded side by side that afternoon, the new system slowly took shape on the screen, but something deeper formed in the space between them. No ceremonial apologies, no dramatic emotional speeches, just action, just shared focus. Carter glanced at Lucas and saw the boy chewing the inside of his cheek, a nervous tic he'd had as a toddler. But this time, when their eyes met, Lucas didn't look away. He held the gaze. And for Carter, that was everything. No longer a stranger in his own home or a visitor in his son's life, he was something else entirely now, a father in construction. And as Lucas leaned in, typing a new header into the core of their Proteus system, Carter saw the name ripple across the screen, bold and final. Proteus, protect, transform. The boy smiled again, wider this time, and Carter didn't need to say anything, because in that moment he understood they were no longer fixing what had broken. They were building what had never existed. The pen hovered above the signature line longer than Carter expected. The courtroom was quiet, not because of tension, but because of gravity. The kind that doesn't shout, but sits in your chest. Carter had signed 1,000 documents in his life, mergers, acquisitions, NDAs, patent filings, but none felt like this. This one, deceptively simple in black ink and legal formatting, meant something none of those others ever had. It meant permanence. He looked to the right, where Lucas sat with his hands folded in his lap, wearing a shirt he had picked out himself, not because anyone told him to, but because for the first time he cared. Carter met his son's eyes. They didn't exchange words, but something passed between them, a pulse of shared knowing. Carter signed. No fanfare, no applause. Just the scratch of ink and the tightening in his chest. The papers weren't about custody. They were about choice. Lucas had a father, now not because he needed one, but because both had finally chosen to be one. As they stood, Carter extended his hand. Lucas took it. And for the first time, they walked out of a room not as strangers bound by obligation, but as a family bound by decision. They didn't go home immediately. Instead, Carter made a quiet detour. Lucas didn't need to ask where they were going, he knew. The cemetery wasn't far, but the silence on the drive stretched longer than the road. When they arrived, Carter stepped out first, waiting to see if Lucas would follow. He did, slowly but not hesitantly. They walked together, no rush in their steps, until they reached her grave. The stone was simple. Her name. Dates. A quote Lucas had picked. Carter hadn't known that until now. She chose love, even when it cost her. Carter knelt without a word. He didn't know how to pray, not really. But he did know how to speak honestly, finally. "He's safe now," he whispered, brushing a leaf from the stone. "And I am too." His voice cracked on the last word. Lucas stood beside him, eyes fixed on the engraving, jaw tight but unmoving. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. The boy didn't just carry grief, he honored it. After a few minutes, Lucas crouched too, placing a folded drawing at the base of the grave. Carter didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to know. Respect, after all, was part of love, too. They returned home without speaking much. The house, for the first time, didn't feel like a place they were surviving. It felt like one they were shaping. Carter went to his office to check in with his team, but Lucas moved toward the core server room without waiting. Carter watched him from the hallway camera feed, noticing how naturally the boy navigated the system now. There was a confidence in the way Lucas typed, but also something gentler, intention, not just intelligence. Moments later, Carter joined him, leaning against the doorway as Lucas ran a custom script through the mainframe. "What are you doing?" Carter asked, not with suspicion but genuine curiosity. Lucas didn't look away from the screen. "Just updating something." A few seconds passed, then the screen blinked and a phrase appeared, simple in its font but enormous in meaning. Carter read it aloud. "Not all silence is absence. Sometimes it's just waiting." He looked at his son, stunned. "Where did you?" Lucas shrugged. "I just thought, maybe it's true." Carter nodded, slower than he expected. "Yeah, maybe it is." Later that night, Carter sat on the edge of Lucas's bed, watching the boy as he slept. There were still so many things he didn't know how to say. He had spent so many years hiding behind logic and efficiency, mistaking action for connection and silence for indifference. But Lucas had taught him something different. That silence could mean attention, that watching could be a form of care, that presence didn't always need to be loud to be powerful. He looked down and saw the edges of one of the mother's letters poking out from beneath the pillow. Carter didn't reach for it. He knew better now. Some things weren't his to read. Some things were meant to be held close and revealed in time, or never at all. And that was okay. He reached over instead, brushing a hand gently through Lucas's hair just once before standing to leave. The boy stirred slightly but didn't wake. Carter paused at the door, whispering more to himself than to anyone else. "I'm still learning, kid, but I'm not leaving." That, too, was a promise, the kind that needed no signature. The next morning, Lucas was already awake when Carter came down. He was in the dining room, laptop open, a bowl of cereal half-eaten beside him. Carter poured himself coffee and sat across from him. "You're up early," he said. Lucas didn't look away from the screen. "Got a new patch for Proteus." "Security update for the orphanage servers." Carter blinked. "You implemented the orphanage branch already?" Lucas shrugged. "I figured. They shouldn't have to wait." Carter set his coffee down, overwhelmed for a moment by how far they'd come and how much of that was Lucas leading the way. He reached over, tapping the boy's wrist lightly. "Proud of you," he said, "not just because of the code, because of who you are." Lucas paused, then offered a quiet thanks. And then, with that dry smirk only he could pull off, added, "Took you long enough." Carter laughed. Real laughter. Not forced, not performative. It filled the room, and Lucas didn't retreat from it. He stayed in it. That was new. And so it ended. Not with fanfare, not with dramatic closure, but with something infinitely more valuable. Continuation. The signature was only paper, the project only code. But the bond between Carter and Lucas, that was alive now, chosen, built. They would face Monarch and whatever else came together. But first they had this, a home, a future, a message in the code that spoke louder than noise ever could. Not all silence is absence, sometimes it's just waiting. And finally they both understood what that meant. We put our hearts into every story we share here, not just to tell something touching, but to create moments that stay with you. If this story meant something to you, let us know in the comments. What did it make you remember? What did it make you feel? We're not just a channel, we're a community, built on real stories and genuine emotion. Every like, every comment, and every new subscriber helps us keep bringing you more content like this, carefully crafted and deeply human. Subscribing lets us know we're not alone in this journey, and neither are you. Take a look at our other videos. There's always something waiting that just might speak to your heart. And remember, stories like these take days, sometimes weeks, to shape with the care they deserve. Your support means the world to us. Thank you for watching. We hope to see you again very soon.